You are listening to ProveText, a Glossa House podcast exploring Scripture and all things related to it. New episodes are released daily. For more information, check out glossahouse.com and subscribe to our channels on Spotify and YouTube. Welcome and enjoy.
Hello and welcome to ProveText and Glossa House TV. I am Michael Halcomb, and today I have the great privilege of talking with my friend Colton Moore. Colton actually works with Glossa House. He does a lot of different things, kind of a Swiss Army knife a little bit. Colton, it's good to see you, man. How you doing?
Doing well. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, well, you're on Christmas break. I assume you're an educator. Are you about ready to start your second semester back up?
Yeah, actually, we've got this weekend, and then we go back on Monday. My students come back on Tuesday, and I'm actually pretty excited about this semester. I teach 7th grade, and we're about to start The Hobbit. And so
Okay.
whenever I teach The Hobbit, it's always a good
Nice.
good time.
Yeah. Well, that seems right up your alley. I'm not surprised to hear that. One of the things I want to talk about today is your book. So I'm going to go ahead and show, if anybody's been around following Glossa House, they know about the book probably.
Yep.
But it's called Beyond the Horizon, an appeal to parents for classical Christian education. And you wrote this with Joe Benhouse or Benhouse. Just go by
That's
Benhouse.
right.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yep.
Yep.
Ben.
So go ahead.
Yeah, we did. The book's kind of got an interesting history. Ben, unfortunately, couldn't make it tonight. He's an educator of over 40 years, and 25 or so of those years has been a classical Christian headmaster. And so I think about 10 or 15 years ago, before I met him, he had written a manuscript with this title. At least, generally with this title. And whenever we got to know each other, going on 3 years now, he mentioned it to me, and I read through it, and I said, "Ben, this is brilliant. This is brilliant." He's like, yeah. He said, do whatever you want with it. I said, if you're serious, I'll do it. And so what I did was I took the manuscript in its original form. I cut a lot out. I added a lot. I rewrote a lot. Added an entire chapter, and we worked together on it for a year and a half.
Wow!
And you guys accepted it. So
that's a good looking cover you got there.
It is. I wonder who did it.
So there's a couple of things, even just with the title, that's interesting. The first thing that jumps out to me is an appeal to parents. I mean, so clearly there's a focused audience here, and I'm assuming you mean parents of children, particularly probably Christian parents of Christian children, because there is a wing, right, of this whole classical education movement that isn't necessarily Christian, but they're interested in like the classical education. So you have CCE, classical Christian, here. So talk to us about the demographic that you guys are aiming for.
Yeah, that actually comes out pretty clear in the book. Where the book is an appeal to parents who may not know about classical Christian education. So in that way, the book could function as an introduction of sorts. But even more particular to parents who know about it and for some reason aren't convinced by it, or just have a vague acquaintance with it. Some Christians hear classical education and think it's strange because it's not the status quo of a public government-funded independent school district. And it's Christian in that it takes the approaches of for lack of better terms, the Trivium, grammar, logic, and rhetoric, that whole taxonomy, and it looks at it through a Christian biblical worldview. I worked for a couple of years at a classical charter school that was funded by the state of Texas, and it was very much classical. It was very much a high level school. It was a wonderful place to work at. Had a great time there. Made some great friends. Wonderful educators, most of whom were Christians. But it wasn't a Christian school, so most of my students at this school, in a pretty affluent area in the DFW area, were Mormon students, Muslims, and Hindu students.
Wow.
And all of them taking Latin and reading Aristotle and reading about church history and reading large portions of the Bible, even. And so that was a unique spot. And I think in a democratic republic like our country, that kind of school has a really important place. But we're writing to Christians in particular, singling them out because we believe that the ultimate telos of education is going to be to the glory of God and to the sanctification and spiritual maturity and growth in Christ of the individual.
Yeah, I worked at, so we were involved, my family, my wife and I, my kids, in classical Christian education for about 7 or 8 years, and we've in the last few years moved away from that just because of life circumstances, not because we were against classical Christian education.
Right.
And I taught at a classical school, teaching upper school rhetoric, Latin, and debate. It's an interesting area to live and move and sort of have your being in, because it's like the families who are in on it are like in on it.
Oh yeah.
Right. They are full on subscribers, and there's some hard buy-in from families and even the educators. So I've moved myself in these circles for a while, and I think it's interesting. I have my own qualms or critiques with the CCE, things it could be doing better. So what is the book itself like? You're making an appeal. What is the appeal?
Good. The appeal is for Christian parents, to see that their role in raising their child necessarily includes their educational upbringing, if you will. That the buck is going to stop with them, so that whatever parents, for example, whatever education a parent decides for his or her children, the ultimate responsibility is going to be placed on the parent during these years. And then secondly, that the best way to fulfill that as a Christian parent is to send your kid to a classical Christian school, or have your homeschool model be classical and Christian. I don't think we say it in the book. No, we don't say it in the book, but I think a good argument could be made that homeschooling, if it's possible for a family, would be the ideal scenario. And lots of things can preclude that from happening, to finances, to parents not being really good teachers. And there's a good teacher down the street at a great classical Christian school.
Right.
But the appeal is, hey, parent, we are ultimately responsible for our children's paideia, raising them, instructing them in all sorts of areas. And secondly, the best way to fulfill that is to have a classical Christian model. And then the first half of the book just deals with principles. What is classical Christian education? Why do we read books? What's Latin for? Where did this classical Christian thing even come from? A brief little synopsis and history of it. And then the latter half takes you through 8 different periods that you might see at a classical Christian school. Ben and I aren't, well, we're naive in many regards, but we're not so naive to think that classical Christian education is a monolith. That there's a wide spectrum in the classical Christian world, and so we're just saying, hey, if you were to take a visit of any classical Christian school and you were to walk through a 10th grade math class, this is probably what you're going to see. Or if you walk into a 7th grade Latin class, this is probably what you're going to see, and here are the rationales behind it. And so we do that through the various different subjects, so to speak, that you might find.
Yeah, so you were mentioning, I mean, even like the end of education, right? The end goal. You mentioned like to the glory of God. One of the things that I focused on a lot, and even though my kids aren't in classical Christian education right now, like we don't, my wife and I, we don't harp on grades, right? Like, and our kids have incredible grades, like taking AP classes, like 4.0 GPAs, and like our kids are. We've never harped on grades, but always viewed the end goal of their primary education, one, to glorify God, but two, just to become a good human, right?
Yes.
Yes. And it's not this sort of utilitarian view of education where like the end goal is to get a job, or the end goal is to have the diploma from A, B, or C school. Like it's to be a better person, like to be a good human.
Yeah, we framed it. We framed the title along those lines that when thinking about education, parents need to look beyond the horizon of standardized tests, GPAs, good college, good job, cozy house, all these things that we're trained, at least I was trained in my upbringing, to think that, hey, you're going to school to get a good college. Well, why do you go to a good college? To get a good job. Why do I want to get a good job? So you can get a good house. Why do I need a good house? So you can live a comfortable life and provide a happy, good context for your family. It's like all those are good things. But that's a step too quick. We're putting the cart before the horse here. And even like sidestepping a major part of education, which is the moral formation of a kid.
Right.
And there's no standardized tests for morality, unfortunately.
Yeah, I mean, today it's morality is self-defined, autonomous, and anything seems to go. So that's interesting, that the looking beyond the horizon of like what's just put in front of us, like shoved in front of us, and it's like the formation of becoming a good human being, a good citizen. These are things that I think education is lost and really needs to recover. Yeah. So have you heard any feedback from anyone on the book? Has anyone, what are folks telling you? Have they had a chance to read it? Is it still too soon, or
Yeah, I think a couple of things. There's a lot of great classical Christian literature out there, and a lot of big names who are producing some really great material for the movement. And so a couple of small name figures like us don't get as much recognition right off the bat. However, I will just bring this up because a friend and I have been chatting for the last 3 or 4 weeks on and off via text. He's been reading the book, and one of the questions that he's had for me is, one of the critiques he's had is like, you guys talk a lot about education in the abstract, and I'm all on board with that. Minus a few figures that we may recommend in the footnotes. But he says, but what is education like? Rather, who is education ultimately for? And that this kind of education is in large part comprised of private schools, which require lots of money.
That's right.
And so you're necessarily appealing to those parents whose families can afford that kind of education. What about the families who can't afford that? And we talked a lot, and he's challenged me to think to be more aware of families of all stripes who may not be able to send their kid to such a school. Like what's for them? And I think school vouchers for private schools are kind of a hot topic these days. Here, at least in my state where I'm at.
Yeah.
It's
North Carolina has school choice. I know, and they help with that. Yeah.
Yeah, Arkansas's got it. Oklahoma and Louisiana. I'm in Texas, and Texas is like on the fence, and it's a hot topic. People either really hate the idea of vouchers, or they really love them. And I think vouchers could be a good thing for private for families who want to send their kids to a private classical Christian school but just can't afford it. It would be a detriment to small rural government funded schools, and that's a whole other issue. But so who specifically is education for? I mean, this kind of education historically was reserved for the higher aristocratic families of ancient Greece and Rome, and even in the church with ancient monks and clergymen who would be trained in multiple languages and logic and rhetoric and well versed in the scriptures and in philosophy and the quadrivium, and not so much for the layperson who was a farmer and had to keep crops and animals.
Yeah. So I think that's a fair critique, right? Because the classical Christian education can get super expensive super quick. Also, it's not everywhere. Like it's, there are some places that it's just not accessible, and that's where you're talking about, maybe homeschooling is an option. But when classical Christian is not accessible, and then, homeschooling isn't an option, you don't have many choices. I don't know. I guess I would think like one response to that is, the onus doesn't really fall on you as an author of the book to find the solution to making CCE affordable. That I think falls on each academic institution wherever it finds itself. So I guess on the one hand, like I don't think that should detract from the argument that you guys are making. On the other hand, it's something worth exploring, right? Another thing I wanted to talk about here, in the book, you guys, well, you mentioned the Trivium already. And for people who may not be familiar with CCE and the Trivium, wondering if you could say a word about that. You also have the Quadrivium. I don't know if you're familiar with that, but you talk a little bit about what's the Trivium or Quadrivium. What's the benefit of all that?
Yeah. So, in our minds, real succinct, the Trivium is, the Trivium seems to be the most natural way that God has structured human learning, the most efficient and effective way to take the basics of a material, make sense of it, and then reteach and communicate that to others. And so the Trivium is an ancient pattern that I think I recently traced at least the word trivium back to like the 900s AD, so like the 10th century. And it's generally a pattern, a taxonomy of, if you will, of structuring education in terms of grammar, logic, and rhetoric. Hence the trivium, try. Where the grammar stage is a stage where you, in short, more or less to varying degrees, take in a bunch of information. You learn something new. If we're to use a metaphor, it's where you open up the Lego bucket and you pull out all the Lego pieces and put them on a table, and you examine every single Lego piece to see what each piece is like, what color it is, how it could fit with other pieces, and so forth. And it's all laid out before you. The logic phase is where, again, this is kind of like a matter of emphasis and not hard boundaries, but it's a phase where you begin to rationalize and learn the rules of reasoning and begin to take the basics of the grammar stage and to make sense of them. To use the metaphor, it's when you begin to take the Lego pieces and you put them together and understand how these things fit together and how it can make certain other contraptions, and you learn the rules of putting them together. It's the period in education where you begin to reason. In modern logic classes, you'll learn a whole host of ancient terminology as far as logic's concerned, all sorts of fallacies and technical jargon to help you with that process. And then the rhetoric phase is when you take all the basics you've learned, you take the rules of logic and reasoning and that you've applied to the knowledge you have, and then this is where you begin to regurgitate not regurgitate, but I guess like repackage in an eloquent. Yeah. There we go. Yeah. Rearticulate all that you've learned in a beautiful, eloquent way. It's even in the realm of reteaching others what it is you've just experienced. To use the metaphor, you're taking that creation that you've built with the Legos and you're showing someone else how to properly do it for themselves. And in our modern day classical Christian education circles, these three, this trivium is applied. I think beginning of the 20th century is when people began to apply this ancient form of the trivium to younger children. So kindergarten through 5th grade or so is generally the grammar stage. 6th through 8th or 9th is the logic. And then 9th and 10th through 12th grade is typically the rhetoric phase. And it's not like you're not using logic or reasoning in the grammar stage. Like, of course, we want our 3rd, 4th, and 5th graders to understand what a reason for something is. And so we're not like withholding logic from them in the logic phase, and we're not withholding grammar from them in the logic phase. But it's just a matter of emphasis. How are we emphasizing the material we're teaching these kids across these various different fields of study: history, arithmetic, especially language. One other feature that goes into this is the study of ancient languages. Particularly historically, it's been Latin. I've heard arguments for Latin before biblical and ancient Greek, and I've heard arguments for biblical Greek or ancient Greek before Latin. So
and I know there are a handful of schools out there, if I'm not mistaken, that even have the option of Hebrew.
Yes,
I know of at least one or two.
There are. So you had me, or like a year and a half ago or so, we made a big database, and I looked through all of the classical Christian schools in America, and there was probably 5 to 10 out of like 1,000 to 1,200 schools that are offering Hebrew. So not much, not many.
Yeah, it's pretty interesting. That was as a Latin teacher, taught 9th through 12th grade Latin. I tried my darndest to get a Greek class implemented into the curriculum, and it just it was the biggest battle, and I just didn't understand. I understand if you're a classical education, right, like strictly, but when you throw that Christian in there, it makes more sense to me to do the Greek than the Latin.
Yes, absolutely.
That's a big frustration of mine, and it's almost like it's almost like Latin has become like a tradition within this small classical Christian education realm, and people don't want to let it go. I don't know. It's just weird.
Yeah. Well, I think a couple of thoughts. The first thought is pedagogy. Because we're English speakers, I think it's pedagogically better to start with Latin and transition into Greek, because it's easier to grasp because you're using the same characters. The cognates are a little bit more prominent in when you're looking at a Latin word compared to a Greek word, and it makes learning the case system a little bit easier, I think, on a younger student. But then that provides a great transition soon thereafter to get into Greek, to learn this whole new character with a really similar case system. But the second thing is, go ahead.
Let me interrupt you there. I don't.
Yeah.
So I'm not like anti-Latin. Again, I was a Latin teacher, and Orberg is amazing for that. And there's all kinds of other great resources. I taught my Latin classes in Latin, which was really cool.
Oh yeah.
Our elementary, our logic school teacher did the same. So I think in grades like 5th through 12th, they were doing mainly spoken Latin, which was pretty neat. And then here's the problem I had. K through 12, these students are doing Latin, but it seemed like, at least when I started and when I've probably the year before I finished, that it was just the same stuff over and over for 12 years. There was no real depth in Latin. It was just like the same old stuff every year, just repackaged in a new book or something like that. Does that make sense what I'm saying to you? Like,
it does.
Yeah, that was my biggest frustration. So what you're saying is, do the Latin then transition to Greek. I agree. Let's do Latin K through 6. Let's do Greek 7 through 12. Like that was my idea for the curriculum, rather than Latin K through 12 and then just doing the same thing, learning the same several cases and verbs and vocabulary for 12 years. So I don't know, just drove me crazy.
No, I think you're onto something, and especially at a classical Christian school, where presumably the ultimate goal of learning Latin, the ultimate goal I guess it could be twofold. One, utilitarian, so that you can read Horace and Cicero and Augustine in the original Latin,
right?
Which is great. But also more abstract, where it begins to shape the way you think, which is really important as well. But then, classical Christian school, you're also reading the Bible in the original Greek. And so in the book, we make a brief pitch, probably not as lengthy as we could have, but a brief pitch for promoting Greek in a school. Greek's harder than Latin. There are a lot more moving parts that are happening there. But students can do it. There's one school out in Utah, I think. They're teaching biblical Greek in the first grade.
Yeah, they're using. Well, I don't know if it's the same school, but there's a school somewhere in that neck of the woods that's using the Glossa House as their curriculum.
Oh, interesting. Yeah.
So that's pretty cool. Actually, in fact, you remind me. I need to check in with that school because I want to have their principal on the podcast at some point. But so they started this year using our curriculum, and I'm curious to see at the midway point of their first year what things are looking like.
So one piece of criticism also that I've gotten, it's related to Latin. I get a lot of comments from family and friends who don't know about classical Christian education. So I live in Texarkana, Texas, where there used to be a classical Christian school. There's not one anymore. There's like this the metaphorical ruins of a school, and a lot of them ask me like, well, why do you guys learn Latin if it's not a living language? And then we kind of go through the things that we've been talking about here, but it bleeds into another thing of like oh gosh, I just lost it.
Well, as you recover your thought there, I was going to say, but it is a living language. I mean, it's increasingly being.
Oh, I see.
I mean, it's still used in the Vatican tomorrow. Right before I got on the phone or got on this call with you, like literally 2 minutes before I signed on to meet with you, my buddy just called me. He's like, "Hey, you want to go to Latin Mass with me in the morning?" And so like the Mass is done in Latin, right? Like, so you have it done in churches. You have it, of course. The Pope, he's always like doing stuff in Latin, and then like University of Kentucky and Pulitz Institute, all these other institutions are doing spoken Latin. So I would hesitate to call it a dead language at this point, but
well, even if so, my rebuttal to them is usually something like this: like even if you assume that it is a dead language, the reason why you would rather study French is the exact same reason why I want to study Latin, so that we can interact with people who have
right.
have communicated or are communicating. I've got Irenaeus right there in Latin and Greek, and you're communicating with Irenaeus,
Right.
as he's at least the translation of him,
Yeah.
and same thing with you communicating with somebody in French. So like not knocking on modern day languages. I love languages, but we're just trying to say that the impetus to study an ancient language is very similar, if not the same, as the impetus to study a modern language.
That's a good point. Yeah, I agree with that. Yeah, I think getting into and even just beyond like communicating with these ancient writers, I mean, there's a preservation factor too, like preserving that knowledge and handing it down, like not letting it dissipate or die or evaporate,
Yeah.
There always needs to be people who are holding on to that knowledge and passing it on to the next generation.
Yeah.
So there's a preservation
Absolutely.
factor as well. So Latin, have the language piece there, the Bible piece, and
Yeah.
I think that's an intriguing aspect for Christians in particular. It may be a turnoff to those who aren't Christians, but I've seen the flip side of that. We had a family friend when I was teaching at this classical school. They enrolled their kid in the third grade. My son was in the same class, and 3 weeks into the school year, they yanked their kid out of the classical school. And I was asking the dad, "Well, why did you do that?" "Well, we don't want our son learning about Greek goddesses and gods. There's only one true God.
Yeah.
We're Bible believing Christians, right? There's only one true God." And so there's that like tension that exists for some people in terms of like going the route of Greek mythology, but then going the other direction, there's a rub for some people, too much Bible, for some people. So it's an interesting thing.
Yeah. We I taught at so we actually have a chapter on Bible class that I inserted into the book that wasn't there in the original manuscript a decade or so ago. I've taught at a Christian school, private Christian school that wasn't classical, and I soon realized how Sunday school like trained the students were. Like
right.
you would have students 6th grade through 12th grade.
Yeah.
Like it's like they knew what kind of answer that they think you were wanting, and it's like no. I want you to interact with the Bible and not just give me like some pat Sunday school answer. And so I think schools, Christian schools, should treat Bible class as they would in large part a literature class, where you're reading through it, you're examining what the storyline, major themes, watching them develop. Thankfully, we've got lots of great theology and biblical theological literature out there to help you. And biblical literacy is important, and not just, when I say biblical literacy, not just knowing the story of Noah or the story of Samson, the story of David and Goliath, but like this meta story of God's promised seed being proclaimed and crescendoing up to the coming Messiah to redeem all that's lost, and just watching that story unfold and then seeing yourself in the story and teaching that to students, that gets me really excited.
Right.
And
as long as I've been in the field of biblical studies, which is just 20 plus years now, I've heard, and I agree with this. Christians and church folk are largely biblically illiterate, so that biblical literacy stuff is huge, and it's a real thing we need to focus on. I'm working on a piece for my blog right now, but it's making the argument that maybe we need to also start thinking about biblical curiosity, because I feel like that's got to precede biblical literacy to some degree, right? If people aren't curious, they're not even going to want to read. And part of that comes from bad Bible teachers, boring, boring Bible teachers. And here's another thing that has fueled this sort of cultural ethos of don't question the Bible. Whereas in sort of a literature class, no, come in, let's be curiosity. What's this character doing? What's the narrative arc?
Yes.
And all that.
And what's assumed in such a conclusion of don't question the Bible is that the Bible is the inspired, written word of God, and it's authoritative for your life. And that is true. But whenever you come to a literature class, you're dealing with a text that's not authoritative on your life in that capacity. But whenever you come to the literature class and you question it, I'd be willing to wager that hardly anybody that's conservative is coming to that book and saying, okay, where can I find that this author is wrong? Rather than,
right,
what can we learn from the author? What's the author trying to communicate to us?
Right.
And so coming to the Bible especially as a 5th through 9th grader, where you're that's the peak of your curiosity. You haven't yet become too cool and apathetic. You're excited to investigate. Coming with those questions of, hey, why did Paul say this right here when a chapter before he seems to say something different?
Right.
I know that the Bible doesn't contradict itself, so what's going on here? And let's have that conversation.
Right.
And that's really good.
Yeah.
That's what you would do in a literature class.
Yeah.
So I want to be clear. I don't want to put a 1-for-1 with the Bible and say like Homer or Shakespeare. But there are lots of similarities because they are both written by humans.
To an
extent.
What we're talking about or talking around is what's been called inductive Bible study, essentially.
Yep.
Where you're looking at the literary forms and the narrative arc, and you're exploring the characters and the rhetorical devices and the logical structures, and all those, the grammar and the syntax, and you're doing just this fully orbed Bible study, and that's a beautiful thing, this inductive Bible study. And I feel like that's been squelched a bit by this whole don't question the Bible. Bible's authoritative. And that then leads to these boring Bible classes, which drains curiosity, sucks the life-givingness out of the scripture for students. And I don't know.
Well,
go ahead.
Middle school students in particular, and high school students too, they can smell a phony a mile away.
Right.
And if you're a middle school student or a high school student at a Christian school in a Christian Bible class, and either the teacher is just really monotonous and boring, or contradicting himself with his life, or treats the Bible in a mundane way that's not just thrilling, they're not gonna most of them aren't gonna check in.
Right.
But you get a good teacher, a good solid pedagogue who loves the Bible and can show all of its literary patterns and make connections to your personal life along the way, and hold you to a high academic standard. in my experience, it comes alive. They begin to become more interested. And so one of the things too that I would do in Bible class for middle school and high school students was we would read a lot aloud. In all my literature classes, we read aloud a ton. And you'd be very surprised, these 17-year-old kids who've never read the book of Genesis, never read the Gospel of Matthew, and they say, "Whoa, the Bible says that?" It's like, yeah, it's pretty cool, isn't it?
Yeah.
So,
that's great. That was my practice. It wasn't for the years that I was teaching at the high school. There wasn't a document, a paragraph, a sentence that we would read in class that was not read out loud. So everything was read out loud.
Yeah.
So I think that's that oral, hearing it, faith comes by hearing kind of thing, right? That's huge.
Yeah.
So let me do this as we start to wrap up here. Let me give you the floor. What is your elevator pitch? I'm asking you to make 2 elevator pitches, and I kind of hate the elevator pitch thing. It's so like, I don't know, like deconstruction or whatever. But I'm gonna still put you on the spot. Like, what's the elevator pitch to those watching or listening to get your book?
Yeah. The pitch would be, if you've never heard of classical Christian education, or if you have but you don't know much about it, get the book. It's written informally, but it's academic enough to be rich and thorough. And Ben House is he's a comedian. He's hilarious. Puns and jokes everywhere along the way. So you'll have a fun. It's an easy read, fun read, and I think you'll find it enlightening.
Second pitch and it's interesting because at present you're teaching in a public school system.
Oh, that's good. I didn't clarify that. Yes,
you're still acting as sort of an apologist for classical Christian education. So
yes,
even as an and also shows you're not antagonistic toward public education. Although I have my hangups about that, and you probably do too. But give your pitch. Give your pitch for classical. Like, if a parent is on the fence or curious, like looking into CCE, what would you say to them to get them on the other side of the fence?
Yeah, I would say what makes our classical Christian school different from any other public school out there will be the emphasis on the moral and virtue cultivation that you'll find at the school. You'll not only have high academic standards where you're reading whole books and studying ancient languages and studying the realms of logic, but the educators at this school are just as concerned, probably if not more, with your students' growth in virtue and in the knowledge and the love of the Lord Jesus Christ. And that in itself is worth it, I think.
Well, good pitches there. Well done. So for those of you watching, listening, thanks for that. If you get a minute, please head over to glosahouse.com and click find that Beyond the Horizon. You can search for it. You can scroll down just a little bit. It's easy to find from the homepage. Beyond the Horizon, an appeal to parents for classical Christian education, by Joe Ben House and Colton F. Moore. We didn't talk about the foreword by Louis Marcos, who's a real fun guy.
Yes. Wonderful man.
We've had him
really
on
thankful
your
for him.
podcast a bunch of times, and this podcast he's been on. So just a great guy, full of energy. But yeah, go get the book, and after you're done with that, check out some of Gloss House's other offerings. And Colton, it's good to see you, man. Good to talk to you. Keep up the great work.
Likewise, brother. Yeah. Thanks for having me on.
All right, friends, we're going to stop there and say we hope that helps.
Interested in growing your ancient language skills but not sure where to start? Glossa House can help. From illustrated readers and short stories to lexicons and grammars, Glossa House offers a variety of resources for beginning, intermediate, and experienced ancient language learners. Head to glossahouse.com today. Glossa House, language resources for the global community.